smoking section with Stephen Helfer. Welcome. I had a kind of an interesting experience on Saturday because I did something which I was actually kind of scared to do and which really does not have a lot, if anything, to do with Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights, and I do try to stick to that subject here on this show and on our Facebook. We don't branch out into all kinds of political extraneous, but I attended the Straight Pride Parade, which was held in the Boston, actually it was a march from Copley Square all the way to City Hall. And I think it was something that was kind of put down by just about everybody, even conservative Cambridge or Boston talk show hosts kept saying how they really didn't think it was necessary and it wasn't appropriate and sorts of things like that. And of course the mayor didn't want to grant it a permit, but he really had to because the organizers had to jump through certain hoops to get such a permit, and they did. And a lot of people were very, very critical of it. And I was interested in it because of the fact that I think there is kind of a political correctness that surrounds sexuality now that is really being foisted on people, such as what pronouns you use. And for example, at the Cambridge Public Library, they have transvestites coming in and reading stories to children. And there's, of course, gay rights parades and Gay Rights Month. And it seems that if you question any of this, you are going to be pilloried. And indeed, the straight rights people were pilloried by just about everybody. Everybody had to distance them. And I'm suspicious because even some of the conservative commentators were very careful to do nothing but use negative adjectives about them. But at least the conservative commentators said they did have a right to peacefully assemble and freedom of speech. But they were definitely questioning what they considered to be an attack on traditional Judeo-Christian ideas of sexuality and of male and female and man and women. And this is something that is really being foisted, I believe foisted very heavily on a global scale, not just in the United States. And I was very leery about going down there because I felt there was a good chance that I would be physically attacked by people who fashion themselves as warriors against hate and warriors against fascism, warriors against racism, and so on. And indeed, there were many people there who were wearing masks, who were carrying weapons, shouting obscenities, making obscene gestures at marchers. And of course, as we all know here in Boston, after the march was over, they turned their ire onto the police and insulted the police, cursed them, made obscene gestures at them. And it's interesting, I think, because they are supposedly against hate. They don't want any kind of right-wing groups to espouse hate, yet they seem to be filled with rage and bursting with rage. And the way they express themselves and I think probably most of these people have college educations, is to shout obscenities and make obscene gestures. I mean, one might think with all the money that is spent on them in terms of public education at a public university or a private university, they would have somewhat more refined ways of expressing disagreement than shouting obscenities and making obscene gestures. But that seems to be their preferred method, and they seem to feel very entitled to do this anywhere in the middle of downtown Boston where there are tourists and the general public. They feel are entitled to, as I say, use profanities and demonstrate in a very unruly way, in a very ugly way. And yet they say they are the ones who are standing up against hate. And I think it's not altogether dissimilar to what happened up at Middlebury College a few years ago when Charles Murray, a conservative, was speaking up there, and they not only attacked Mr. Murray, but the professor who had invited him up to the college to speak. And here you have a very, very educated, elite college like Middlebury, which I'm sure costs $60,000 to $70,000 a year, and you have all of these students who I'm sure are predominantly white and have lived very privileged lives, but they consider themselves fighters against fascism and racism, and they feel entitled to physically abuse people as well as verbally abuse them. But one thing I did notice, I was very interested because the people in the march and the people who listened to the speakers were a very assorted lot. There were blacks, Latinos, Asians, even some people who were gay. There were let me think. It was half female, and of the 5 speakers, 3 of them were female, 2 of those were black. And essentially, what I think gathered most of those people together was generally a conservative political view, and I would have to say also a pro-Trump political view. But the major thing was, I think, is a feeling that this kind of global attack upon traditional sexuality is something they oppose, and they're particularly concerned about the way this is being introduced to young children in primary school and secondary school, all about that they're teaching all of these things. And I can see people disagreeing. I think people are entitled to disagree, and people are entitled to not agree and to dispute. But when people feel that they have the right to verbally and physically abuse people who are in a parade and are exercising their First Amendment rights of free speech and peaceful assembly, none of the speakers condemned anybody, not even all of the counter-protesters who were abusing them, and it was very peaceful and, as I say, conservative, and yet Congressman Ariana Presley said that we were all fascists and racists, even though not one word was said about race at the event. But we are fascists and racists, and essentially that kind of label was really adopted by certainly most people on the liberal side. I mean, and there was not the slightest element of either of those at the event from any of the speakers, and anyone who cared to listen would have to acknowledge that. Well, that's all I'm going to say about the event. Oh, except I met a lot of very interesting people, people who uh, are not the kind of people who join mobs, not the kind of people who feel that they have to be politically correct. I think a lot of very interesting people, young and old, male and female, again, different races. And I think, and of course, I can't say this for sure, a lot of them smoked. It was really interesting. I think the kind of person who would join a march like this, not do what everybody else is supposed to do, not take, what the media says that these are all racists and fascists, is the kind of person who would probably not be the kind of, would be more likely the kind of person to smoke. And so I was very happy to see a lot of smokers there. And I did use the opportunity to hand out Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights, which of course is similar in the sense that we are basically considered enemies of the state by the media and by the smokers are just the most downtrodden, and anybody who defends smoking is wicked, and the tobacco companies are just the most vile, horrible people that you can say anything about. So I think there's some similarities. Certainly there's a similarity in conformism of thinking. And there is this kind of conformism of thinking that we all have to use the proper pronouns, and we can't use this word and we can't use that word. And if we don't do that, we're, as Hillary Clinton said, deplorable. And so I think there is some overlap there, although I have to reiterate, the Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights takes no political views others than those that are directly related to tobacco. And we don't endorse Republicans or Democrats, etc., etc. So consider that all a kind of digression from my usual program, but still I enjoyed being there, and I enjoyed supporting those people who are willing to, I wouldn't say put their lives on their line, but certainly put their comfort on the line and put themselves in danger, because these people who ran this event certainly did so. And I must begrudgingly admit that Marty Walsh, the mayor of Boston, did supply enough police protection that we were not torn to pieces, which it looked like the crowd wanted to do. Anyway, let's go to the Smoker of the Week. I hope I can pull her up. Indeed, I have. Congratulations to me. And we just have a little bit to go on this. Let's see how we do this. All right, there we go. Here is someone who is a very important historic person of the 20th century, not the 21st century, but of the 20th century. And her name was Coco Chanel. And I certainly think she's got a cigarette there, although, yes, yeah. And she died in 1971 at the age of 87. And she had lived in the Ritz Hotel in Paris for many years. In fact, she had lived in the Ritz Hotel during the Second World War. And she is considered probably the greatest fashion designer of the 20th century. And according to the one newspaper one British newspaper, I think it was the Daily Mail, who wrote that she smoked 50 cigarettes a day. That's 2.5 packs a day, and that you could not find a photograph of Coco Chanel without a cigarette either in her hand or in her mouth. And which was kind of interesting to me because talking about the media and how uh, often distortedly they report the news. There was a BBC documentary on Coco Chanel, and when I watched it, it was on public television. There were almost no images of Coco Chanel with a cigarette. So I am suspicious, and my suspicion is that the BBC, when they did this documentary, this biography of Coco, um, very carefully sifted through all the photographs available of her and found those few where she wasn't smoking and chose to use those few because, of course, they want to wipe the anti-smoking groups and the government and in collusion would like to eradicate smoking not only from now and in the future but from the past. And as someone said, when they discovered that at the Winston Churchill Museum in London, outside on one of the very big banners they had of Winston Churchill with the photograph on it, that someone had airbrushed the cigar out of Winston Churchill's hand or his mouth, even at the Winston Churchill Museum. And someone noted that it's not only in Eastern dictatorships that people airbrush photos and stuff. So I think the BBC effectively airbrushed the cigarettes out of the biography of Coco Chanel. And here we are. I'm back again and ready to get and stay on tobacco issues. And one of the things that, some bad news in a way, but news that shows just how busybody-ish and how authoritarian anti-smoking groups and government anti-smokers are. Michigan has now been the first state to ban flavored vaping materials. And the governor of Michigan, the Democratic governor of Michigan, says that she's very happy to do this, and she lambastes, according to the news article I found, that she is very happy. Gretchen Whitmer, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, she lambastes the tobacco companies for using candy flavors to hook children. Now, it's always these kinds of paternalistic nanny state activities they always like to do it, well, adults are one thing, but we're doing it to save the children. And it's actually a very effective strategy. But I would think, and I do think it's very unfair of Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer to accuse the vaping companies of doing this to hook children because adults really like vaping flavors that got a lot of flavor in them. And, it's just like these days if you go to drink martinis, half the martinis are flavored bubblegum flavor and chocolate flavor and coffee flavor and strawberry flavor. So accusing the vaping companies of trying to hook children is a very unscrupulous political tactic, in my opinion. And unfortunately, Michigan has now banned all flavored vaping. I certainly hope it doesn't reduce the number of teenagers who are vaping, because I think vaping is a very benign activity for teenagers and for adults. And I also believe that teenagers are entitled to a certain amount of freedom themselves. They are not all fools who can't make any decision for themselves. Of course, now it seems that even 18-year-olds in many states, we say that they can't choose to smoke or anything. They have to wait till they're 21. Um, and of course, we're saying that about adults. So many things that adults. Um, I mean, even the whole smoking thing. The idea that the government would have the kind of petty, tyrannical power to ban smoking in all restaurants, in all bars, and in this very studio where I'm talking now, is something that I think in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s would be unthinkable. But I think modern life is very very petty in many ways. We have so many things that are regulated, and such petty things are regulated, and the idea that 18-year-olds can make their own decisions is something that is rapidly becoming something of the past. And now, we have people who are 26 years old living on their parents' insurance and so forth. And this idea that this kind of prolonged adolescence, that actually a lot of public health authorities, I think, believe that the prolonged adolescent goes right up until the day you die. That they have to make decisions for you, they have to take care of you, and that if they don't, we're all going to go to hell in a handbasket. And another article is a lot of people are upset that a lot of anti-smokers, that is, that the FDA hasn't used more muscle in even bringing more pressure on smokers to make it even to try to take their pleasure away even more. But I saw some interesting, the FDA director, there's a fellow now who's the FDA director, he notes that the FDA since 2009, when the FDA took control over tobacco, authority over tobacco, they have spent $1.6 billion on tobacco research. And I mean, I don't know what kind of research that they could possibly do that hasn't already been done, but I assume what that research really means is giving a lot of money to well-connected research institutions associated with academia, like Harvard, Johns Hopkins, who feed at the federal trough gluttonously, and to hand out money to all these so-called researchers. And they're not really researchers. They really are anti-smoking activists. And the only kind of research they do is to see how much further they can manipulate science and statistics to come up with even more scare tactics to use against us smokers. Also, the FDA director mentioned that Mitch Zeller, now he's Mitch Zeller, that they have spent $870 million on anti-smoking advertising. Well, I mean, geez, at what point do you just say, well, people know what you think about smoking, can't you possibly leave them alone? But these people can't. They really can't, because they are terribly addicted to telling other people what to do. And that kind of addiction is an addiction that really runs much, much deeper than any other addiction. Certainly any kind of putative addiction to tobacco. So many millions of Americans have given up tobacco, but to give up the desire to control other people's behavior is something that very few people are able to give up. Thanks for watching tonight. Thanks for allowing me to digress a bit. Good night.